The wind moved like a restless spirit over the ridge, tugging at the ragged hem of the desert's twilight. The cabin stood alone, its roof patched with tin, its logs weathered silver by years of unrelenting sun. Smoke curled from the crooked chimney, the only sign of life in miles of red rock and sage. Inside, the widow knelt on the rough plank floor, her long fingers tracing a prayer over the rim of a clay bowl. Her hands were raw, cracked from work, and her dark hair hung loose over her shoulders, streaked with strands of dust. She was small but not fragile. Every line of her body carried a memory of survival. A single candle burned on the table, casting thin light over the walls, where shadows seemed to breathe with the wind's rhythm. She moved like someone used to silence, each gesture precise, efficient. She had learned to live alone without expecting kindness, and she wore her solitude like a shield. There was no softness in her expression, only the steady calm of a woman who had buried her dead with her own hands and asked no one for help. Beyond the hills, thunder murmured. A storm was building, and the desert air thickened with the smell of rain and electricity. She paused, listening. The sound came first like a whisper, a rhythm out of place. The soft thud of hooves. Her breath caught. She rose, taking the shotgun from beside the door. The iron felt warm from the fire as she braced it against her shoulder. Through the warped glass of the window, she saw him, a rider crested the hill, hunched in the saddle, his coat flapping like a black sail. The horse beneath him stumbled, weary from miles of hard travel. He didn't ride like a raider or a ranch hand. His pace was slow, deliberate. As he drew closer, the brim of his hat shadowed his face, but even from a distance she saw he was tall, broad-shouldered, with a way of moving that spoke of both exhaustion and wariness. He stopped a dozen yards from her door, rain beginning to patter against the dust. He raised a gloved hand, not in greeting but in a silent request for shelter. She didn't lower her gun. Evening. His voice came, low and rough, like gravel under boots. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke, her words edged with caution. "What do you want?" "Shelter," he said simply, "just till the storm passes." The wind kicked up, rattling the shutters. She weighed her choices, eyes narrowing. Strangers were dangerous. She knew that better than anyone. But so was turning away a man on the edge of a storm. Finally, she stepped aside, her fingers still near the trigger. He led his horse to the lean-to by the cabin and entered quietly, ducking his head under the low frame. The firelight flickered over him as he removed his coat, revealing a revolver at his hip and a scar that ran down the side of his neck like a pale river. He smelled of leather, rain, and distant gunpowder. She gestured toward the hearth. "You can warm yourself." "That's all." He nodded, saying nothing more, and crouched to unlace his boots. There was a heaviness about him, as if he carried something more than the saddle's weight, a man accustomed to leaving places behind. She returned to her seat but kept the shotgun near, her dark eyes following him closely. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. Inside, only the crackle of the fire filled the space between them. He sat on the floor, repairing a broken strap on his saddlebag with calm, practiced motions. He didn't ask her name, nor did he offer his own. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but charged, like two animals studying one another across a clearing. "You live alone," he finally said, voice low. It was not a question. She looked up at him, her face unreadable. "No one comes here." He nodded as if he understood. His eyes were pale, gray like a winter sky, and they held the kind of distance found in men who'd seen too much and spoken too little. Hours passed. The fire dimmed, casting long shadows over the walls. The storm outside roared and then softened to a steady drizzle. She offered him a plate of beans and cornbread, more out of habit than generosity. He accepted with a nod and ate in silence, careful, almost reverent, as if he'd not had a home-cooked meal in months. After they ate, he rose and went to the door, standing there a long time, watching the rain streak across the dark horizon. She watched him, too, noting the way his shoulders tensed at every gust of wind, every distant crack of thunder. He was a man built for vigilance. But tonight, that watchfulness was tinged with something else. Loneliness, maybe, or weariness so deep it showed in every line of his stance. She finally spoke. The barn's leaking. You'll sleep better inside. He glanced back at her, surprise flickering across his features. I'll stay by the door, he said. She nodded once, returning to her chair. Trust wasn't something she gave easily, but there was something about him, an unspoken respect in the way he carried himself, in the quiet distance he kept, that made her lower her guard, if only slightly. The hours slipped by, the cabin warm against the chill. He sat near the door, hat in his hands, eyes closed but not fully asleep. She dozed lightly by the fire, the shotgun across her lap. The storm finally passed, leaving only the soft drip of water from the eaves. When morning came, the world was washed clean. The desert stretched out in shades of gold and sage, the sky a pale blue after the storm's fury. He rose silently, slipping on his boots, and stepped outside. She followed him to the porch, arms folded, her face unreadable in the dawn light. He saddled his horse with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown the night before. As he mounted, he looked at her for the first time in full daylight, and she saw the weariness etched deep into his face. He tipped his hat, his voice soft. Thank you. She only nodded. Words felt heavy in the clear morning air. He turned his horse toward the open land, the rising sun his back, and rode away without looking over his shoulder. She watched him until he disappeared over the ridge, her hands gripping the porch railing. Something had shifted in the silence he left behind, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of wet sage, and she turned back inside. The cabin felt emptier than it had before. The town sat crouched at the edge of the prairie like a beast waiting to strike. Wooden buildings leaned under the weight of years, their false fronts flaking paint in the midday sun. Dust curled along the main street, stirred by the shuffle of boots and the wheels of wagons. A saloon piano banged out a crooked tune, barely audible over the murmur of men and the clatter of horses at the hitching posts. Into this hum of suspicion and noise rode the cowboy, his horse weary but steady, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He dismounted and tied the reins loosely, scanning the storefronts with a soldier's caution. The brim of his hat tipped low, hiding eyes sharp enough to catch every glance, every whisper. Inside the saloon, he found shade and smoke, the bitter smell of whiskey filling the air. He ordered coffee, drawing a few curious looks. He didn't care for liquor when he wanted his mind clear. The barkeep poured it without comment, but the way he lingered said everything. Outsiders didn't come here without reason. The conversation at the far table drifted his way. Two men leaned close over their drinks, voices sharp with malice. Should have burned her place a month ago. One muttered, the words thick with whiskey. Ain't right, her living up there. Apache blood and all. Town's cursed enough without her. The other man spat on the floorboards. Widow like that don't belong here. Heard she put a bullet in her own husband. Bet she's hiding more than goats up in them hills. The cowboy's fingers tightened around his cup. He kept his face still, but his shoulders stiffened. He knew hatred when he heard it. This wasn't idle talk, but a plan fermenting in cheap liquor. He drained his coffee, left coins on the counter, and walked out without a word. The afternoon sun hit him hard as he stepped into the street. He adjusted his hat, his jaw tight. She'd been nothing but guarded kindness and quiet resilience, and here she was, the subject of venom from men who'd never met her eyes. He untied his horse and rode out of town, dust swirling behind him, every instinct pulling him back toward the ridge. When he reached her cabin, she was splitting wood, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her arms strong from years of labor. She glanced up at him with that same calm gaze that never betrayed fear or surprise. Town folk don't take kindly to strangers, she said, not stopping her work. Seems they don't take kindly to you either, he answered. She didn't flinch, though her swing paused for half a beat. They don't like what they don't understand. Always been that way. He dismounted and offered her a hand with the woodpile, stacking logs neatly beside the door. She worked alongside him in silence, and together they moved with the rhythm of survival, their breaths syncing with the creak of the axe and the smell of fresh-cut cedar. As the sun lowered, they sat on the porch, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. He watched her hands as she ate, steady, unhurried, marked by scars of a life spent defending herself. Her eyes held an old sadness, a loneliness he recognized, the kind that settles deep and rarely stirs. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "This is my husband's land," she said softly. "Only thing he left me. Folks can talk all they want. I ain't going." There was steel in her voice, not bitterness but determination. He nodded, respecting her resolve. The prairie wind swept through the sage, carrying the smell of distant rain. Night came, and with it the stillness of the open land. He offered to check the perimeter before bedding down by the door. She watched him move with quiet efficiency, his eyes sweeping every shadow like a man used to danger. He carried himself with a soldier's calm, but there was a heaviness to him, a story behind the scar that traced his neck and disappeared beneath his shirt. Later, as the firelight flickered through the cabin window, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "They think I killed him, you know? My husband. That's why they hate me." He turned to look at her, but she didn't meet his gaze. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined, knuckles white. "I didn't," she said. "Raiders came through that spring. White men, not Apache. They left him bleeding in the dirt. By the time I buried him, folks had already decided I was a reason." Her voice didn't tremble, but the silence that followed was heavy. He didn't offer comfort. He knew words rarely healed wounds like that. Instead, he sat with her in that quiet, letting it settle like dust over a grave. "You believe them?" she asked suddenly, her dark eyes cutting to the firelight. "No," he said simply. "I believe you." Something flickered in her expression then, a soft crack in the wall she built around herself. She turned back to the fire, and neither spoke again for a long while. The next day, he rode back into town, though every instinct told him not to linger there. He stocked up on flour, ammunition, and coffee beans, ignoring the stares that followed him like flies. The men from the saloon leaned against the post outside, watching him with lazy malice. One spat in the dirt as he passed. "Better watch yourself, stranger," the taller one drawled. "Ain't wise keeping company with a squaw widow. Folks might get ideas." The cowboy stopped, one hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver. He looked at them, slow and deliberate, his expression carved from stone. Reckon folks should mind their own business. The man's smile faltered. The cowboy turned and mounted his horse, riding out with calm confidence, though his eyes never left the men until the town was far behind him. Back at the cabin, the widow was tending her goats. He unloaded supplies without comment, but she noticed a tension in his shoulders. "They'll come," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I know," he replied. She straightened and met his gaze, her expression steady. "Then we'll be ready." There was no fear in her voice, only a resigned strength that stirred something deep in him. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. As evening fell, he took a seat on the porch, rifle across his lap, eyes on the horizon where the first stars flickered like distant campfires. She sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Neither spoke, but their silence was not empty. It was an unspoken alliance, a shared understanding that trouble was coming, and neither of them would face it alone. When the coyotes began to howl in the distance, their voices echoing across the dark prairie, the cowboy adjusted his hat and scanned the ridge with calm eyes. He had no intention of leaving now. Dawn broke cold and brittle, the sky streaked in pale gray. The cowboy woke to silence broken only by the soft snore of horses tethered near the cabin. He scanned the horizon from the porch, rifle resting in his hands. But the land seemed still, the sagebrush swaying gently in the morning breeze. The widow stepped out behind him, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her dark hair loose, eyes scanning the distance with the instinct of a hunted creature. Neither spoke. The quiet felt fragile, a calm stretched in overcoming violence. By midday, the tension snapped. A rifle cracked from somewhere in the hills, the sound sharp as breaking glass. One of her goats stumbled and fell, blood soaking into the dust. The widow gasped but didn't scream. Her hand went instinctively to the knife at her waist, eyes narrowing as she searched the ridge. The cowboy moved quick, calm, ushering her behind the corral as he crouched low, scanning for movement. The shot was a warning, a message scrawled in lead and blood. "You're not welcome here." "They're watching us," he said softly, voice steady as steel. She didn't flinch, though her jaw tightened. I know. That night, they sat in the dim glow of the cabin's fire. She mended a tear in his sleeve, her hands precise despite the flickering light. He watched her silently, the way her shoulders carried tension like armor, the way her lips pressed in but didn't tremble. She didn't ask him to leave, but he could feel the unspoken fear in the way she kept glancing at the windows. They want me gone, she whispered, threading the needle through fabric. They'll have to go through me first, he said, not as bravado but as a vow. His voice was low, steady, and she paused, looking at him for a long time. There was something in his expression, a hardness carved from years of violence, yes, but also a tenderness he rarely let surface. Her gaze softened for just a breath, and in that silence, something passed between them. Trust. 2 days later, they found the water barrel near the porch tainted, a slick sheen on the surface. The cowboy poured out and scoured the hills for signs of movement, finding only boot prints leading back toward town. Whoever was stalking them wasn't hiding their intent anymore. Won't be long, he said grimly, returning with his rifle slung over his shoulder. She stood near the corral, hands clenched at her sides. Then let them come. That evening, as the sun bled over the mesa, he sat on the porch, cleaning his revolver. She brought him coffee, her fingers brushing his briefly as she handed him the tin cup. He felt the warmth of her touch long after she moved back to her chair by the fire. She spoke suddenly, voice soft but heavy. My husband was a good man. Taught me to shoot, taught me to read. He said I had a right to this land as much as any of them. When they killed him, they wanted me to leave. I stayed. He listened without interrupting, the firelight casting shadows over his scarred face. You've killed men, she said quietly, not as accusation but fact. He nodded once. Too many. Do they haunt you? Every night. Her eyes met his, steady and dark as a desert night. Then maybe you understand why I won't run. He did, more than he could say. The attack came at dusk 2 nights later. A rustle of hooves in the sage, then a torch arcing through the air, landing against the barn's dry wood. Flames licked upward, snapping bright against the twilight sky. She grabbed her shotgun while he took position behind the corral, firing a warning shot into the dark. Shouts rang out, men's voices, angry and reckless. Stay low, he ordered, his voice calm even as bullets whined past the porch. She crouched near the doorframe, heart pounding but hand steady. One man rode close. Torch raised high. She fired. The recoil jolted her shoulder, and the rider tumbled from his horse, the torch sputtering in the dirt. Good, the cowboy muttered, picking off another silhouette with precise aim. He moved like a man born for gunfire, every shot deliberate, every step calculated. The barn roared behind them, sparks flying high into the night. Goats scattered, bleating in terror. He dropped one man, then another, until the attackers fled back into the hills, their retreat masked by smoke and darkness. The widow sank onto the porch, chest heaving, the shotgun across her lap. The fire from the barn cast a hellish glow over her face, highlighting the streaks of soot and determination in her eyes. They'll be back, she said, voice hoarse but steady. He crouched beside her, reloading with quick, practiced motions. Yeah, but so will we. They stood in silence as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, the flames dying slowly in the cool night air. She watched her livelihood turn to ash, her expression calm but not empty. He glanced at her, noting the set of her jaw. The way she didn't cry, didn't break. She was still wrapped in quiet grace, and he felt something stir in him, a fierce desire to protect her, not out of pity, but out of respect. By dawn, the land smelled of smoke and loss. The barn was nothing but charred timbers, but the cabin still stood, blackened by embers but solid. She was already at work, clearing debris, her face streaked with soot, but her movement steady. He joined her without a word, and together they moved like they had been doing this all their lives. As the sun rose, he caught her standing in the ashes, hair loose and wild around her shoulders, the light outlining her like a figure carved from fire and shadow. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and said softly, "They think I'm weak. They're wrong." he replied. Something flickered in her eyes and not quite a smile, but close. She bent to pick up a blackened beam, her strength startling for someone so slight. He helped her, and together they began rebuilding what had been lost, side by side in the quiet morning. The world felt still for a moment, the prairie calm after the storm. Yet beneath that calm was a promise. This wasn't over. He could feel in the way of the rifle slung across his back, in the way the wind carried the faint smell of gunpowder, even as the sun warmed the land. That night, after hours of quiet labor, they sat by the fire, their shoulders almost touching. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was no longer hollow. It was something stronger, forged in smoke and danger, in shared resolve. When the coyotes howled in the hills, he reached for his revolver, and she placed a hand gently over his, just for a breath, long enough to remind him that he wasn't alone. The wind came in restless gusts, rattling the dry grass and carrying the faint scent of rain. The widow stood on the porch, her shawl drawn tight, staring out across the open plain where the horizon shimmered with heat and tension. The cowboy leaned against the post beside her, rifle balanced in his hands. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the ridges where shadows gathered like wolves. Neither spoke. Words felt fragile in a night heavy with expectation. They had spent the day preparing. The windows were barricaded with planks. Extra ammunition lined the table inside, and shallow trenches had been dug along the ridge near the cabin. The air between them carried a quiet understanding, a bond forged not in words but in sweat, blood, and shared resolve. She moved with purpose, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. He watched her work, the steadiness of her hands, the way she carried herself with a courage that humbled him. As the sun bled into the horizon, torches began to flicker in the distance. Shapes moved along the ridge, dark figures against the dying light. The cowboy shifted his weight, thumb brushing the hammer of his revolver. She stepped closer to him, her breath steady. "They're coming," she said softly. "I know." He squeezed her shoulder once before moving to his position near the corner of the cabin. She crouched by the porch steps, shotgun resting across her knees. The approaching riders let out a chorus of whoops, the sound harsh and eager, meant to rattle nerves. But fear had no place here. They were past that. The first shots cracked through the dusk, splintering the porch railing. The cowboy fired back, dropping one of the riders clean out of saddle. Chaos erupted, the night exploding with gunfire, the smell of black powder filling the air. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the cabin shuddered under the hail of bullets. The widow fired once, twice, the recoil bruising her shoulder, but she didn't falter. A man pitched forward from his saddle, and she reloaded with quick, practiced hands. The cowboy moved like a ghost, firing from cover, his expression cold and controlled. He struck with precision, each shot measured, each movement efficient. Torches arced through the air, striking the ground and sending flames crawling toward the corral. He cursed under his breath and shifted position, his rifle spitting fire as he took out another attacker. She grabbed a bucket, dashed outside to smother the flames, her bravery unshaken even as bullets snapped past her. The attackers circled, their numbers greater than before. The cowboy ducked behind a wagon, heart pounding steady as a drumbeat, every nerve alive. He could feel her presence behind him, her courage like a beacon in the dark. A figure emerged in the chaos. The rancher himself, riding hard, face twisted in rage, pistol flashing in the torchlight. "That land ain't yours," he bellowed, voice carrying over the gunfire. The cowboy stepped out from cover, rifle raised. "It's hers," he said, voice calm as stone. The rancher fired, grazing the cowboy's shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot echoed, clean and final, and the rancher tumbled from his horse, the dust swallowing him whole. Panic rippled through the remaining riders. Their leader dead, they faltered, some turning their mounts to flee. The widow took aim and fired again, dropping another before the rest vanished into the hills, leaving only the ringing of spent gunfire and the smell of smoke hanging thick in the cool night. For a moment neither of them moved. The land was silent but for the crackle of fire and the ragged breathing of their horses. The cowboy lowered his rifle and leaned against the porch post, blood soaking through his sleeve. The widow hurried to his side, pressing a cloth to his shoulder. "You're hit," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "Just a scratch," he muttered, though his face was pale. They sat together on the steps, the firelight flickering over them as the adrenaline drained away. The land around them bore scars, bullet holes in the walls, smoke rising from the corral, blood darkening the dust. But the cabin stood, and so did they. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "They'll come back," she said softly. He met her gaze, gray eyes calm and certain. "Not tonight, and not while I'm here." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing hers. She let him hold it, the tension in her shoulders softening just enough for him to feel the warmth of her trust. The moon rose high over the ridge, silver light glinting off the rifle barrels laid across their laps. The prairie stretched quiet and endless around them, the smell of sage drifting through the cooling air. "Why'd you stay?" she asked finally. He glanced at her, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Guess I found something worth fighting for." Her eyes softened, though she didn't reply. She didn't need to. The way she leaned slightly against him, the way her fingers curled around his, spoke more than words could. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and lavender, they stood side by side, surveying the aftermath. The cabin, scarred but strong, stood like a sentinel against the horizon. The land smelled of smoke and gunpowder, but also a victory hard-earned. The cowboy's hour was bound now, the widow's work precise and gentle. He glanced at her as she tightened the knot. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "Had to be," she replied. No one else was coming. He looked out at the hills where the riders had fled, then back at her. "They won't stop, but neither will we." Something flickered in her eyes, a spark of pride, of relief, maybe even hope. She stepped closer, and for a brief moment, rested her head against his shoulder. The contact was brief but grounding, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured. The morning wind swept through the sage, carrying the smell of rain that never came, and he felt something settle in him, a sense of belonging he hadn't known in years. She turned to look at him, her expression soft but steady. "If you'll have me," he said quietly, "I'll stay." Her lips curved, faint but genuine, and she nodded. "Then stay." They stood there together as the sun rose higher, casting